Before I begin, I just wanted to note that the seminar today is actually based on a book chapter that came out last year in this busy cover text, Rethinking History, Science, and Religion, which is edited by the Canadian historian Bernie Lightman. But in relation to a version of this chapter, as well as links to my other publications, including the first chapter of my recently published book that was mentioned. This is where the audience oohs and ahs. Simon, great bedtime reading
yes,
for
thank you.
the children.
The children, yes.
It starts with the Columbine massacre, so maybe not. It does, actually. The first chapter of that book, all of this stuff is available on my academia page for free. So we were asked if we might bring in some of our publications. Instead of that, the academia page has all of that stuff available for free, including journal articles. In any case, getting started, I work with historians, though I'm not an historian. But for decades, historians of science and other scholars interested in studying science and religion interactions have been saying that the conflict thesis, what we call the conflict thesis of science-religion interactions, or what we sometimes call the warfare model of science and religion interactions, which is an idea that really states that science and religion have been in conflict historically, and that they will remain in conflict, is false. So many historians of science have been saying that now for decades. The empirical data does not support the conflict thesis. It just doesn't. The historical data doesn't seem to show that. Instead, researchers have generally endorsed what we call the complexity thesis, which is an idea that's ascribed to the historian John Brooke, an Oxford historian who happened to be one of my thesis examiners. And his thesis, he hates it that we call it a thesis, but his idea, the conflict thesis, he said, it's not a thesis. It's just true. But we call it a thesis. The conflict thesis essentially states that the relationships, he's not that mean, actually. He's like the most lovely, kind person that you could possibly, he would never say that, but he has said something to that effect, that I don't like that people call it a thesis, it's just a statement of reality, based on empirical data. But he basically, the thesis points to the fact that the relationships between science, what we would call science, and what we might call religion, have been quite nuanced, more so than just mere conflict. So we see areas where definitely historically and in the contemporary world there is friction, right? So we see that, but we also see at other times where religion has had absolutely no bearing on science, science had absolutely no bearing on religion, or where scientific ideas at different times in history might have been endorsed scientific ideas. So religious ideas and religious institutions have endorsed certain scientific ideas. So it's much more nuanced than just conflict. Now, these same researchers of science-religion interactions have also puzzled over why the conflict, rather than complexity, persists as essentially an unsubstantiated myth, right? So we get these historians of science who for decades have been saying, look, it's much more complex than conflict. They've been saying it for years and years. So now the issue is, why do people kind of see that as the sort of common sense notion? Why do we still see people saying, of course, religion and science have to be in conflict? And there are different reasons why. One including the fact that several public figures in science or in academia, such as Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne, among other academics, have continued to propagate the warfare model. So we've got some very public figures that have continued to propagate the model despite empirical research from history all the way to sociology, pointing out that the conflict thesis it isn't supported by the data, right? So the idea that science and religion have always been historically in conflict and must perennially be in conflict moving forward we just don't have the data for that. At the same time, I had an experience a number of years ago that led to another possible source of the conflict kind of narrative over complexity model in the modern age. So this is actually a side project of mine, and it came about because when I was completing my doctorate years and years ago at the University of Oxford, I came back to Canada, where I'm originally from, and I taught at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island, and I taught at the U of X. I taught the U of X First Science and Religion course, and the whole premise of the course was to deconstruct the conflict narrative, the warfare model of science and religion, and went through kind of the historical views of science and religion interactions, and then to the modern science and religion interactions. And the interesting thing was, during my office hours, a number of students came to me and said, you know, what you're teaching us is the opposite of what we're being taught in other classes. And so we are being taught that the Galileo affair was, you know, clear proof that science and religion are in conflict, and science and religion will continue to be in conflict to this day. And when I asked these students who was teaching that narrative, they all said anthropology. So years later, when I actually had some research time, I started a side project looking into how renditions of science, religion, combat are being propagated through contemporary university-level textbooks and introductory publications, and I started with anthropology and sociology. So in this presentation, I'll share some of the findings I've come across in examining modern 21st century textbooks, all published in English, and reference publications, and reveal the ways that both complexity and conflict are being expressed to students via introductory materials from a whole wide assortment of fields. So my own previous analyses of introductory anthropology and sociology publications specifically expose the ways that these sorts of texts communicate several discredited religion science myths while still imparting narratives of inescapable and permanent warfare. And what I'm presenting here today builds upon those analyses of social science textbooks and surveys how science and religion relationships are addressed within numerous other fields. And that includes biology, physics, cultural studies, international relations, journalism, philosophy, and psychology. I won't cover all those, but that's where my research went. And the intent was to extend the examination that I'd done with anthropology and sociology, and gauge whether other fields also prove resistance to adopting academic data, like clear empirical data, on the complexity model, which many anthropology and sociology texts are doing. They're resistant to, it seems like they're resistant to accepting academic publications in that area. So to do this, contemporary introductory university level works published, again, only in the 21st century were examined. These include books printed by the foremost publishing houses retailing science and humanities textbooks, such as Altamira, Blackwell, Cambridge University Press, Millen, McGraw-Hill, Oxford University Press, Pearson, Polity, Routledge, Sage, and Thomson Wadsworth. Now, it's important to note that from the outset that in contrast with many social science textbooks, the introductory materials of several different fields attend to religion and science topics without necessarily just invoking conflict narratives. So I took that to be a positive finding after coming out of studying anthropology and sociology textbooks. And these approaches vary. And while they frequently stress non-conflict descriptions of science-religion interfaces, they often do not feature complexity as a defining characteristic. So for instance, a number of biology and physics textbooks communicate sort of short echoes of Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria in describing religion and science interactions, what's called the independence model. And this basically underscores for students that religion and science are just totally different magisteria. They're totally different things. They have totally different domains. And because they do totally different things and they're interested in different topics, they can't be in competition. They can't be in combat. So as the authors of Campbell Biology, which is a well-used biology textbook, note, while indicating that supernatural claims lie beyond the limits of scientific testing, they say, quote, science and religion are not mutually exclusive or contradictory. They simply are concerned with different issues. Other works report on religious faith, the religious faiths of pioneering scientists, such as descriptions of Michael Faraday in Fundamentals of Physics, which indicates that he was, quote, influenced by religion. Similar statements are prevalent within introductory philosophy materials, which often identify how scientific pacesetters as well as philosophical and religious leaders have expressed at least civility between science and religion. So what is notable about philosophy and philosophical pedagogical materials is that many texts not only allude to the intricacies of science-religion relationships, but they also unambiguously endorse complexity. So you get that in philosophy textbooks. And also several philosophy textbooks not only critique the conflict model, but they also supply undergraduates with detailed inventories of the possible ways that science and religion can relate to each other. So consequently, these texts relate that religion and science interactions can be multifaceted, pointing to associations not encompassed in just conflict plot lines. So it is in this context that readers are told in one philosophy handbook, quote, "The warfare view is seriously flawed, both philosophically and historically," and that, quote, the simple assumption that religion and science have been and remain in conflict is falsified by the historical data. Now, while many textbooks include non-conflict narratives and nods to complexity, it's also apparent that numerous introductory publications still adhere, like the social sciences, to the warfare model. So, as with social science textbooks, philosophy and psychology materials often kind of simply mention kind of abrupt references to, quote, long-standing controversies between science and religion, or, quote, titanic battles between science and religion, which insinuate sort of considerable and chronic antagonism. Additionally, textbooks from an assortment of fields rehash really dubitable legends of science, religion, history, often associated with claims about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Scientific Revolution. In some of these instances, which appear specifically in astronomy teaching materials, surprise, surprise, the authors refer to science arising out of, quote, the chaos of the Dark Ages. So science arose out of the chaos of the Dark Ages, or, quote, the intellectual vacuum known as the Middle Ages, unquote. Similarly, a handful of introductory science texts uncritically allude to the Renaissance as the moment in history, quote, when scientific reasoning became a respected mode of thought once again, unquote, in which the rise of science was linked reciprocally with the, quote, diminishing authority of the church in Europe. And if you don't know, these are considered popular myths by most academic historians. In like manner, widespread lore regarding the emergence of modern science as an oppositional force against religious thought during the Enlightenment can also be located in a number of international relations and philosophy textbooks. Working within this framework, the philosopher Nancy Stanlick describes the Enlightenment as the period in which science finally broke, quote, free from the chains of the authority of the church. Now, throughout references to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution, found in social science textbooks specifically, anthropologists and sociologist authors often allude to the ascendancy of heliocentrism, so the idea that the sun is at the center of the earth rather than geocentrism, that heliocentrism as a central event in the development of modern science. So they say, look, really modern science came about when we accepted heliocentrism over geocentrism. And nearly every such occurrence, readers are provided with undisguised conflict motifs. So these themes include descriptions of an anti-rational church led by a papal theocracy, and this fanatical institution condemns scientists who, through experimentation and raw data, sought to overthrow geocentrism, which was clearly an unempirical idea, ensconced within biblical literalism and theological rigidity. And as with social science introductory materials, the textbooks and reference publications of several other fields repeat similar ideas, problematic ideas. It is perhaps not surprising, again, that references to heliocentrism and Galileo are scattered throughout astronomy and physics introductory publications in particular. In many of these cases, however, little is actually mentioned of Galileo's controversial championing of heliocentrism, but there are nevertheless frequent descriptions of Galileo as, quote, the first great experimenter, or, quote, the first true experimentalist who dropped balls of various sizes and weights from a tower. Again, if you don't know, these sorts of stories are really disputed by historians that Galileo did any of these things. Together with reports of Galileo's avid experimentation, astronomy and physics textbooks also perpetuate myths relating to Galileo's confrontation with the church. These narratives fail to note the affair's significant complexities, instead relating the academically dismissed notion that the central problem with Galileo's heliocentrism was its apparent demotion of humanity and the earth from an imminent central place in the cosmos. So in this vein, philosopher Lee W. Bailey tells readers, I like to actually name the people. It just gives me a little bit of enjoyment. Lee W. Bailey tells readers that, quote, Zeus no longer throws thunderbolts from the heavens when science can give a better and fear-reducing explanation. He then states Galileo's rejection of the cosmology of an Earth-centered universe was so controversial because it attacked the parochialism of the anthropological assumption that humans are the center of the cosmos. By the way, the center of the cosmos was hell. Should tell you something about the problem of the demotion of humankind. Likewise, the psychologist Michael Conforti first provides the following account. Perhaps using science to refute religious dogma was not the best approach in the 1600s. But Galileo's search for truth knew no limits. Those near him during the Inquisition heard him whisper under his breath the words, and yet it moves, as he completed his testimony to the papal see. Now, along with repeating the fictitious claim regarding Galileo's whispered pronouncement, there is no proof that he actually stated that. It's a popular myth. Conforti then affirms that the church, quote, needed to see the earth as the center of the universe to justify its position of moral and spiritual supremacy. So Conforti's report points to a trend in several introductory works written by psychologists, which repeatedly tell readers that the church's primary problem with Copernicanism was the removal of humanity from its divinely appointed place at the very center of the universe. Psychologist John D. Greenwood, who tells students that, quote, Galileo was imprisoned, he wasn't, and that he, quote, had developed the telescope, he didn't, indicates that the essential problem with heliocentrism was that it damaged the thesis, quote, so congenial to Christian theology that earth and humanity are at the privileged center of creation. Other introductory materials also provide readers with descriptions of Giordano Bruno, who you may have heard of, who was horribly burned at the stake in 1600. And these stories reflect the conflict legends presenting him as a scientific martyr. I won't get into the details, but historians have repeatedly claimed that Bruno was not a scientific martyr, yet a number of philosophy texts repeat that myth. On the bright side, it's hard to go down after you talk about human immolation. But on the bright side, numerous introductory materials provide assessments of the Galileo affair that do suggest complexity. So here's one from a physics textbook. Galileo's famous encounter with the church had little to do with religious faith, but rather with politics, personality, conflict, and authority. That's from a physics textbook. As the author concludes, quote, today it is generally understood that science and faith are different approaches that are not in conflict. So again, kind of that noma, the non-overlapping magisteria sort of view. In historical and conceptual issues in psychology, the authors note that the popular accounts of Galileo that include references to his religion, quote, religion fanatically and desperately defended its position against the growing influence of science, are historically problematic. So that's a historical history of psychology. And then a list of mitigating circumstances then provided, which I won't list, but they're up, or I won't read, but they're up here. So it's evident, therefore, that when it comes to heliocentrism, complexity can actually and is sometimes communicated in textbooks. We can see that it's possible to teach students about complexity around things like the Galileo in physics textbooks and in other textbooks. Despite the prevalence of warfare narratives. Likewise, descriptions of the Darwinian Revolution in introductory materials can also include both complexity and conflict motifs associated with early reactions to the origins of species, and the famed 1860 Huxley-Wilberforce debate, which you may have heard of, it happened at Oxford, and the legendary 1925 Scopes trial, which was the theme of the play and the movie Inherit the Wind, if you've seen that. Now, in terms of the history of the Darwinian Revolution and evolutionary theory, one thing to note is that you see, as with various sections of history and psychology texts that mythical accounts of the Huxley-Wilberforce debate exist and are promulgated through a lot of textbooks. So there's like these mythical accounts of the Huxley-Wilberforce debate that occur in modern textbooks, which those myths have been readily dispatched by historians, but they're still being advanced by academics in textbooks. So here's one. This is a quote from A History of Modern Psychology, 2011 text. Referring to the ideas of Darwin, Wilberforce congratulated himself that he was not descended from a monkey. The reply came from Huxley: "If I had to choose, I would prefer to be a descendant of a humble monkey rather than a man who employs his knowledge and eloquence in misrepresenting those who are wearing out their lives in search for truth." And again, this is a readily disputed quote by historians that much of this occurred. So in summarizing this very, very brief overview here, when we look at how science and religion interactions are presented in modern textbooks to contemporary university students, we do actually see multifaceted results and less than straightforward observations. It still does not seem to be the case, for example, that textbooks of any one field that I studied relate only conflict or only complexity. Nonetheless, as with social science textbooks, which display conspicuous tendencies towards communicating warfare narratives and science religion myths, there are notable trends that can still be distinguished across a number of fields. For instance, unlike social science publications, the textbooks from other fields rarely claim that science itself has directly led to the secularization of society. So you see that a lot in sociology and anthropology textbooks. They say, well, there was an ascendancy in science in the modern world, and that led to secularization, which is a thesis, by the way, that has been discredited within the social sciences itself. That's one thing you find a lot in sociology and anthropology materials, but you just don't find that outside of sociology and anthropology. Yet it does appear that with regards to perpetuating conflict themes, numerous philosophy and psychology textbooks are especially inclined to resemble social science publications most closely in propagating conflict narratives. At the same time, unlike other textbooks, numerous biology and physics publications tend to avoid conflict discourse by appealing to message of science, religion, independence. They just say, look, let's not talk about conflict, they're just different things. You don't... Various biology and physics textbooks also communicate facets of complexity by stating that many scientists have actually been religious, whilst religious individuals frequently and enthusiastically accept science both historically and in the modern day. And what's more, myths and misconceptions about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution are scattered throughout astronomy, international relations, philosophy, physics, and psychology texts. And these are exemplified in legends of modern science arising in enmity with religion from the dark ages of human history, as well as popular tales of Giordano Bruno and the Galileo affair. And astronomy works specifically exhibit a proclivity to repeat widespread notions about science arising following repression of rational thought that occurred during the Dark Ages of religious dominance. And some such publications also relate that the central to the science-religion dispute over heliocentrism was Copernicanism's demotion of humanity and our planet from a central position in the cosmos. Along with astronomy and physics texts, psychology materials in particular are apt to communicate this message to students. The real problem with heliocentrism was that it removed our divinely ordained central place in the cosmos. Yet, in many cases, various authors of introductory books associated with all of the disciplines mentioned in my study can also be found deconstructing science, religion, myths, and even advocating for, in one form or another, some measure of complexity. Nevertheless, while aspects of complexity are certainly clearly discernible, it is also evident that discord narratives persist throughout introductory materials ranging from the humanities to the sciences. As a consequence, the presence and utility of the conflicts model in introductory materials is not simply dependent on whether the thesis is supported by a preponderance of data, or if it can be suitably communicated within the genre constraints of textbook publications, because we see that it can be communicated. Some people do it. At the same time, warfare model is still being published and talked about to students despite the data. Instead, it may well be the case that conflict or complexity are communicated to undergraduates around the world depending upon just the inclination and research or lack thereof performed by the textbook authors themselves. And as I think I've been able to show, this results in the ongoing perpetuation of warfare themes in university-level textbook materials used around the world today, despite the now decades-old refrain that the conflict model is an outdated, academically rejected thesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sure you all agree that was a fascinating paper. I guess we're going to have a few minutes of Q&A now, so if you have questions, feel free to put up your hand. I might start with the first one. It seems, from my understanding, and you can disagree with this, of course, that the driving force behind the debunking of the conflict narrative really is the discipline of history.
That's right.
Is there some kind of time, like a lag in this filtering through the other disciplines? Is this what is happening, or do they know about it, but it's convenient for them to perpetuate their conflict thesis? What's your take on that?
So I think there are a number of things going on here. So yes, history really led the way in problematizing the conflict thesis, but the conflict thesis did come from some historians. But let's not mention that. But really from the mid-20th century onwards, historians are just good and bad. But dirty historians. But the historians, they really started to problematize the conflict thesis from the mid-20th century onward, with people like John Brooke and others, John Hott and some other historians of science, and they were really pushing for this. And so yes, but then it did get picked up by people in sociology. So people like Elaine Ecklund, for instance, she's a sociologist in Texas at Rice University. She says, well, let's also problematize this with scientists in the modern age, and she interviewed scientists all around the world and found that there was absolutely no correlation between science or religion and either acceptance or rejection of science. It just happened to be, if the scientist was religious before they became a scientist, they tend to be religious after, and if they weren't, they tended to be non-religious after, right? And many countries have scientists with greater degrees of non-scientific belief or non-religious belief, but there are other countries, for instance, that the scientists actually proved to be more religious than the average population. So that was problems, but it's the historians that took it up. Now, in terms of, so one of the things I started to look at, especially with the anthropology and sociology textbooks, is who are they citing? So are they going to the historians, okay? So some of them actually cite some of the earliest warfare model materials to back up their views. So they're clearly not doing any research. So part of the problem, most times they don't cite anyone. When they do cite people, they're citing very old problematic research. Here's an example. And then when they do cite people, they actually are doing so without actually considering what that person is saying. So one of the textbooks in one of the publications that I have, I say, well, where are they getting this from? So they're getting from Draper and White. So they're the people that are often affiliated with the historical narrative of the conflict thesis. Two books actually, they say, talk about Galileo, and they incorrectly refer to the Galileo myth. I looked at who they cite. They cite John Henry, who's an excellent historian on Galileo. John Henry says the opposite of what they're saying. So they're just not doing the research. That's it's the other issue is with sociology and anthropology and often psychology. The conflict model is actually part of it's a genesis myth of their disciplines.
It's positivistic kind of.
So if you look at the all of the original August Comte and Tyler and all of the kind of the founders of anthropology and the founders of sociology, the founders of psychology, Freud as well, they all said basically religion is a cognitive problem. It's a problem in societies. We are moving, it's a necessary stage in human evolution. And we will move past that when we become scientific. And so, and now we're kind of moving in this age of studying the science of humanity, social sciences, right? And all of them, so all of these, those, especially those very recent disciplines of psychology, sociology, anthropology, conflict narratives of science and religion were necessary. They're part of the genesis narrative of the entire. So how do you shake yourself from one of the founding narratives
Yeah.
of your discipline. Even though the disciplines now in sociology have rejected, let's say, the secularization thesis, textbooks still refer to it, even though it's been rejected by the data in the disciplines themselves. And so there's two parts. One is, look, they're just not doing the research. They just aren't, or they're doing very bad research, right? Like, I would fail students if they said this about John Henry. I would. John Henry didn't say it. So they're doing bad research, very little research, and there's also a sort of narrative within their disciplines themselves. And I think there's also ideological, personal reasons as to why to advocate that, science and religion conflict. And I think historians maybe could do a better job of trying to advocate the empirical data that they have to the general public and to, well, not just the general public, to other people at the university.
Yeah. Sure. That's helpful. Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation, Doctor. My question is this. What do you think is the rationale for the promulgation of this conflict theory throughout disciplines? Is it due to merely the nature of the disciplines, or the worldviews of those who herald each discipline, or maybe something else?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. So it's that partly some of these disciplines actually have conflict as they were part of the kind of the founding stories upon which the disciplines were started. So that we get in Freud the idea that religion is a psychological disorder, essentially, right? And so if you have that narrative, you have to have the whole sort of worldview around it, which states that we need to overcome religion. And we see the same sorts of things in sociology, and kind of the idea that humans, almost teleologically, have to move away from religion to become, rational scientific societies. And so I think that's just ingrained. I think it's almost common sense in some disciplines. Like, of course, that's the way it is. So there's a bit of that. And then in some cases, so there were a number of articles, for instance, where people were citing Richard Dawkins when they're talking about science and religion. And so there's an ideological sort of perspective there, right? So that person was clearly had a very specific view on religion and non-religion, and they weren't citing the proper sources. So it's I don't know the minds of the writers, but part of it is the power of the genesis narrative of the discipline you're part of, and sort of common sense ideas that we have sort of inherited from the 19th, 20th century about religion and science.
Thanks, Tom, for a marvellous presentation. My question sort of ties to this founding myth of disciplines, but I'm fascinated by the disciplines that are willing to abandon the myth and those that are wanting to cling to it. So, for example, physics, they have had to, because their discipline has begun to postulate invisible dimensions, so beyond the third dimension, they actually have to go past the visible-invisible duality in empiricism. And biology likewise has had to postulate a link between mind and matter and emotion and matter, and so it's had to move past that same duality. I think those other disciplines are really philosophically almost tied to an empiricism and a duality between visible and invisible. Are you looking, and if you postulate it that way, can you then step past the personalities and the ideology debate and address it from a philosophical point of view?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it wasn't really what I was looking for. I just wanted to see how does conflict and complexity, how are conflicts and complexity expressed? Yeah, I mean, perhaps there's room for that kind of analysis. Here's my skeptical side. I think with science textbooks, there's kind of a bit more of an impetus to sell product, especially in the U.S. So in the U.S., for instance, we know that textbooks have actually, let's say, from the middle of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, removed references to evolution because there's a large portion of the population that doesn't want to be taught evolution. And it's much more important to make money on textbooks because it's a big business, right? And so I think with the physics and with the harder sciences to biology, softer science, but a controversial science, it's almost a strategy to just say, look, let's just not talk about this. Let's just get down to the brass tacks of biology and physics and astronomy. They're separate from religion. All right? Let's sell some books. So I think that's my more cynical side, right? At the same time, the physics and the biology textbooks, and like the more science textbooks, they actually do show a higher level of research. So they actually are saying, this is what Michael Faraday did, and they're citing historians. So I think that's also just a reflection of due diligence and research. There was, for instance, there's one biology textbook where I think it was plant biology, where the author says, science and religion don't have to be in conflict. Here's an example. I am a Christian. Let's move on. Which I found quite interesting. So and that's in America. Like this is I think a textbook that I could get off at UQ, the shelf at UQ, bring them out. So, but anyway, I think maybe there's a bit more research done on the science side, and my cynical side says they just want to get back to selling textbooks to everyone.
Well, please thank Dr. Tom Aechtner. Well, next we're going to welcome to the podium Ms. Michelle Pfeffer. Michelle is already a decorated scholar despite only having just recently submitted her doctoral thesis. Michelle and I shared principal supervisors for our doctoral study at UQ and also had desks next to each other. And I could only hope that some of her talent somehow rubbed off on me, but I don't think it did, unfortunately. Her PhD thesis, Mortalism and the Making of Heterodoxy in 17th Century England, was funded by an Australian Laureate Fellowship Postgraduate Research Award. And the thesis examines some of the first and most influential people in the 17th century England to deny the existence of the immortal soul. She's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at UQ. She also has a Masters of Science with distinction on the history of science, medicine and technology from Oxford University, and she will be returning to Oxford later this year to take up a position as a research fellow at Magdalen College. So please welcome Michelle as she presents her paper on astrology, science and religion in the 17th century.
Thanks, Simon. I should say we also share a supervisor with Tom as well. Tom is also supervised by Peter.
Oh, yes,
So, yeah.
that's true, it's true.
Small world.
Yeah, it is a small world.
No, thanks for that. So yeah, as you suggested, Simon, I've recently finished a rather large project and I'm starting to turn to some new projects, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of my preliminary ideas about one of them with you guys tonight. And I must say I think it is my funnest and weirdest project. It's about astrology, right? So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so as I say, I'm talking about the history of astrology, and I'm going to be focusing in particular on the process whereby astrology, which was once a central part of intellectual and cultural life in pre-modern Europe, came to be seen as a superstitious pseudoscience in the late 17th century. So I'm going to start with a quote here on the screen from the Enlightenment philosopher Pierre Bay, in a chapter of his with a title which I really love called "Astrology is the Most Ridiculous Thing in the World." I only wish I could write chapter titles like that. But as you kind of can get a sense, he really is quite angry about the fact that astrology was such a powerful force in pre-modern Europe. And his denigration of astrology, which I'm sure some of us here probably sympathise with in some ways, was really in line with how the educated classes had really newly begun to think about astrology at the end of the 17th century, which was in rather sharp contrast to the standard view even only 100 years before this. This was published in the early 1680s. So astrology, as Bay argued, was this sort of vain and almost embarrassing superstition, an endeavour that had no basis whatsoever in science. And so this particular figure, like other Enlightenment philosophers, thought that astrology was one of many superstitions that had to be sort of purged from society so that we could advance and kind of move forward to a scientific, kind of rational sort of way of viewing the world. So the decline of astrology kind of ostensibly fits into this sort of classic secularization narrative whereby society really needs to purge via science and rationalism things like religion and magic and superstition, right? And on the face of it, the fact that astrology really lost its credibility during the period of the so-called scientific revolution might seem like answer enough for astrology's decline in this period. And it's particularly tempting to point to the Copernican Revolution, which Tom mentioned earlier, as being particularly responsible for the reason why people started to reject astrology. And this is because traditionally astrology was premised on the idea that Earth was in the center of the universe, right? So a geocentric view. And so on this kind of account, the Earth is in the center of the universe and it's sort of being circulated by all the other planets, including the sun, and then the stars sort of far away, and these sort of impart influence onto the Earth, right? So that's what traditional astrology kind of sort of sees the world as functioning in this way. And so of course we might think that if heliocentrism, the idea that the sun is actually the center of the universe, well, the center of at least of our solar system, it sort of comes to sort of the fore, we might assume that astrology kind of must have been fundamentally undermined at this point, right? But unfortunately for me as a historian of science, history of science is seldom this simple, right? It's always a little bit more complicated. And so when we look a little bit more closely, which is what some historians have done in the last sort of 20 years, we find that astrology was actually not really threatened by this new view of the universe, right? It's kind of surprising. So astrologers were actually some of the first people to popularize Copernicus's, like, originally quite controversial view of the universe. And they quite easily assimilated heliocentrism into astrological theory by, quite simply, as they thought, just recalculating the positions of the planets, right? And like all other astronomers in the period, Copernicus and even Galileo himself was a practicing astrologer. He studied astrology, did astrology for princes and da-da-da, right? So it's a little bit more complicated. And when it comes to science more generally in the 17th century, there were no experiments kind of conducted to refute astrology. And many of the members of the kind of burgeoning scientific societies, so like the Royal Society of London, for example, they contained all these sort of members who were astrologers, right? Naturalists and also astrologers. So the decline of astrology has kind of remained a bit of a puzzle for historians because science kind of doesn't really seem to be quite enough to explain why the West rejected astrology. So it seems like something more was clearly needed, but historians aren't really quite sure what that might have been. So tonight I'm going to maybe make a suggestion about what that might have been. And my thought is that Pierre Bayer and his work actually provides sort of a useful hint for what that extra something might have been. So as I've suggested in the book from which this quotation is drawn, he describes astrology not only as a pseudoscience, but as a superstition, right? And specifically a superstition that grew out of, as he argues, the idolatrous practices of pagans in the ancient Near East. So this was ultimately a historical argument against astrology, one that was theologically loaded, of course, but it was one that was aimed at casting aspersions against astrology's origins. So I'm going to suggest tonight that this particular argument, which became common currency in the 18th century, it actually had its origins in humanist scholarship, right? So the research of humanities scholars in the early modern period. And it was the culmination, this particular argument, of a historical revisionism that had been building momentum for over a century. So research by early modern humanities scholars, in other words, produced sort of a new revisionist account of the history of astrology. And this led to astrology being considered irredeemably superstitious and non-scientific long before scientists even came to examine it. Okay, so after that rather long introduction, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to move quite quickly through three sort of key points, right, on the screen here. So the first, the central role of astrology in pre-modern Europe, which is kind of going to help to give us an idea of the absolutely massive change that was entailed by the decline of astrology. Second, traditional genealogies or histories of astrology and their subversion, so basically the historical discoveries that led people to reconsider the legitimacy of astrology. And finally, the popularization of these new histories, so how this historicization of astrology was disseminated to the public by people like Pierre Bayer. Okay, so to part one. one thing that I really like about studying this is the beautiful images that I get to work with. I was just saying to Simon, it's so beautiful. And amazing instruments as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So when we think about astrology today, at least I did a couple of years ago, we might picture kind of the caricatured, simplistic horoscopes that we might see in, say, a trashy magazine when we're at the dentist, right? Or now, apparently, in smartphone apps, which apparently are really popular amongst my generation, which was news to me, multi-million-dollar companies, apparently, astrology is back. So I might need to change my research, I think, a little bit. But traditional astrology was actually inexplicably complex, right? It was a really highly technical set of theories, and it was closely tied and, at times, inseparable from astronomy. Actually, the words are often used interchangeably. So both astronomers and astrologers held that the planets possess kind of these peculiar powers and influences, right? And that God had ordained that these powers would influence generation, corruption, and basically every other natural and sometimes human process on Earth. So astronomers and astrologers often actually work together quite closely, or were one and the same person most of the time, and they use these amazing mathematical instruments like this to basically chart the precise location of the planets at specific times, which, seems quite normal, but then they use that to predict and calculate their influence on the Earth. And that's when we kind of think, okay, that's a bit different to what we tend to do today in a scientific sort of context. But celestial influence was so central to the worldview of pre-modern Europeans that astrology was actually a critical part of the university curriculum. So during the BA, the Bachelor of Arts that students had to take before they could advance to one of the higher degrees at the time of law, medicine, or theology, they actually had to study astrology. Can you imagine in a BA today having to do a course on astrology, right? But that's just what you had to do, and it was totally normal. And in fact, the main purpose of the professor of mathematics, and I like telling this to my friends who are mathematicians, was to teach astrology, right? That was your main job. And also on the side, to work with the mayor of the city to cast astrological predictions for the town for the coming year, right? Can you imagine that today? Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Links.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I should tell that to my mathematician friends. Here's a good way to get some industry links. So there was thought to be incredibly kind of pragmatic value to teaching astrology to students. And this was because astrologers were thought to be essentially essential to making decisions in all aspects of life. So astrologers were common fixtures, for example, in courts and palaces, and this is partly because their supposed ability to cast horoscopes for the rulers meant that actually they could be quite useful for propaganda, right? So you can say that, this newly born prince, actually his horoscope says that he's going to be an amazing guy, right? Meanwhile, his political enemy, his horoscope, it's not looking too good, right? So they were really useful. And they were also sort of provided a lot of really interesting advice in times of war. So I really like this example. There's this one particular female astrologer in a court in medieval Baghdad. She, before battle, cast horoscopes of everyone in her army, worked out who was going to survive, and sent only them in to fight. So, potentially another use for astrology today. But astrology was actually probably most important in medicine. So celestial influence, the influence of the stars, was thought to provide an explanation for various medical ailments, but especially things like the oscillating symptoms of fevers, right? So coronavirus fever, for example, might be explained by the stars. So the position of the heavenly bodies told physicians propitious or inauspicious times to perform various therapeutic procedures, so things like fasting, purging, but also sort of anything to do with drugs, so when to collect the things for the drugs, when to compound them, and when to administer the drugs as well. And on the screen here are some more lovely images. These are two versions of the Zodiac Man, and I'm hoping you can kind of see from that distance, but basically there's the symbols for the signs of the Zodiac. One on the left is the symbols as they were in the Ottoman Empire, and on the right in Christian Europe. And they're actually positioned on specific parts of the body. And the reason that is the case is because it was thought really unsafe to perform surgery on a part of the body if the moon was actually in the zodiac sign related to that part of the body. Okay? And in some countries, especially in the 14th century, but also beyond, it was actually illegal for a physician to perform a surgery if they hadn't actually first checked the position of the moon. Okay? So, kind of hard to understand, but astrology was just completely fundamental to all these sorts of disciplines, okay? So the perceived ability of astrology to sort of help people to make decisions in all areas of their life meant that it was widely popular throughout every level of society. One particular astrologer working in London, this guy called Simon Foreman, kind of a fictional depiction of him there. He saw thousands of clients a year, right? And people came to him for advice on relationships, travel, their careers and their health and things like this. And he made a lot of money, I'll be honest. Some people think that he was potentially doing it for the money. But, I mean, he's an interesting guy. And astrology was so popular that actually after the Bible, astrological pamphlets were the most printed text in pre-modern Europe, in the early modern period. Okay? So widely read stuff. Astrology was valued so highly that some historians have suggested that the massive translation movements of the 12th century might actually have been spurred by the desire to know more about astrology. Okay? So, what I'm trying to say is, it was an important part of everyday life. So, for the most part, astrology was seen as just a truck, right? Astrology was seen as a perfectly legitimate, yeah, all good, perfectly legitimate kind of method for forecasting God's plans for the future, okay? So astrology had always been subject to some attacks, but for the most part in Christian Europe, critics of astrology were attacking the legality or the legitimacy of practicing astrology rather than the fundamental principles that astrology was based on, right? So the idea that the planets actually did influence life on Earth. So in other words, most pre-modern Europeans acknowledged the reality of astrological influence, but what was up for debate was whether or not people should try and make predictions of this influence. So for many, astrology was also linked to this sort of atheistic determinism, right? Which is obviously kind of, you can imagine that's going to be problematic in a system which assumes future rewards and punishments based on freely willed actions, okay? So that was sort of one reason why some Christians had some issues with astrology. But astrologers actually were quite effective in combating this, and they convinced a lot of people on this front. And they did that with this particular claim that they sort of parroted quite a lot, and that is that the stars incline. So when it comes to human behavior, they can influence, but they don't compel. So they're not, if I do something, I might be influenced by the stars, but I still was able to freely will that choice myself. Okay, so astrologers can kind of jump around these sort of attacks. Although many leading astrologers were themselves clerics, theologians also had associated some aspects of astrology with demonic divination, okay, so some sketchy kind of stuff. But in the 7th century, some of the early Christian writers provided a sort of useful resource by distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable forms of astrology. And this allowed people to sort of disentangle what they thought was astrology proper from kind of the more diabolical arts. Okay? So astrology's relationship, which was often a good relationship with religion in this period, was also helped by the fact that astrology's theological position was actually thought to be quite ambiguous. So as many pointed out, the Bible kind of referred to astrology in various and sometimes contradictory ways. So while the scriptures seem to warn against astrology in passages like Leviticus 19, which cautioned against divination, or Jeremiah 10, which told the Jews sort of don't be afraid of the signs of heaven, because that's what the heathens are afraid of. There are also verses like the ones that I have on the screen here. So, for example, Genesis 1:4 seem to point to God's intended use of the celestial bodies as signs, and Job 38:31 highlighted the sweet influence of various kind of constellations. And these scriptures, and there's others as well, alongside the close relationship between astrology and theology that was sort of forged by some medieval theologians, meant that astrology was generally seen as a very Christian enterprise. And this was helped, as we're about to see, by traditional genealogies, sort of the Genesis myth, actually, that Tom was sort of talking about, of astrology, which traced the science, that's what it was thought of as, back to the biblical patriarchs, okay? So we're going to go to part 2 now on genealogies, these genealogies or histories of astrology. Now, although we tend to associate the 17th century with kind of the broad uptake of experimental science, it's important to remember that humanist modes of research, so the things that we kind of associate with the Renaissance, actually continued to be absolutely central to all areas of inquiry, even science, deep into the 18th century, okay? So these humanist kind of bookish methods of research alongside sort of the more experimental kind of ways of interrogating things, continue to be fundamental, right? So, for example, for practitioners of medicine and the natural sciences, they could provide valuable catalogues of past cures and remedies, or examples of famous or eminent practitioners. But another important thing that they could provide was these sort of historical genealogies. So if a natural philosopher or physician wanted to demonstrate the legitimacy of their approach, they did so in part by writing a history of it, which showed who discovered it and how they discovered it. And contrary to what we might assume, what mattered here was not signalling the novelty or innovation of the work, which is what we would probably do today as scholars, but was actually, you actually wanted to show its antiquity, the great antiquity of what you were trying to do. And this was partly because up until sort of the late 17th century, antiquity almost always equated to superiority. Antiquity was kind of associated with a time in which science, medicine, and even religion were considered pure and undefiled. And if you were really lucky, you could kind of trace back your work or your particular doctrine right back to Adam in the Garden of Eden, who was said to sort of have this direct divine revelation from God, right? And then sort of the story would go that Adam shared it with the other patriarchs, and then the patriarchs shared it with the Egyptians and the Chaldeans, who then disseminated it to the Greeks, and so on and so forth, and it sort of ends up with you today, or in the 17th century even. And until the 17th century, this is what exactly what was said about astrology. So, for example, the famous astrologer and astronomer Tycho Brahe explained in his lectures on astronomy to students that the science of the stars, so that's astrology and astronomy, was delivered to Adam by God and then passed down the generations to Abraham, communicated then to the Egyptians and Greeks, and eventually was sort of grasped by Copernicus and, of course, Tycho Brahe himself. And this kind of mytho-history of astrology had precedents in early Jewish and Christian texts. So just to name a few examples, people like Josephus, Philo, Clement, I mean, there's many of them, explained how Abraham in particular had cultivated astrology and astronomy and introduced these sciences to the Egyptians, right? This is the claim. And Josephus in particular thought that Adam was astrology's first advocate, and that Adam taught astrology in particular to his third son Seth, and it was Seth who systematized astrology and made it a distinct discipline, right? Some other sort of early Christian writers instead located the invention of astrology in the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Chaldeans, who then were apparently able to teach it to people like Moses and Daniel and other Old Testament figures. And of course, still in these accounts, astrology's Eastern origins were something to be particularly emphasized, because it supposedly highlighted the doctrinal purity of astrology, all right? Okay, but of course these histories were undermined, okay? We still don't say these sorts of things today about astrology. In sort of the 15th and 16th centuries, that sort of assumption of a connection between legitimate knowledge and the Near East kind of began to break down. So while early Christian apologists had emphasized the similarities between Christian theology and pagan philosophy in order to procure pagan converts, humanist scholars began to learn more about the history of Eastern philosophy and religion, and they kind of realized that it actually looked quite different to Christianity, right? It ended up looking a little bit more pagan than it did Christian. Okay, so they came to think that the knowledge and the practices of the ancient Egyptians, the Chaldeans, and even the Greeks looked as if they were sort of corrupted by idolatry and superstition. And it was in this context that chronologists and historians began to offer new details about the history and especially the origins of astrology itself. Now, a key figure here was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who devoted 2 books of his massive book, Disputations Against Divinatory Astrology, to demolishing this sort of standard pedigree. So Pico claimed that astrology was birthed not by Adam in the Garden of Eden, but instead by idolatrous pagans in ancient Chaldea and Egypt. These Eastern nations did not deserve admiration, he argued, because their culture was characterized by ignorance and superstition. So the Chaldeans and the Egyptians were certainly skilled astronomers, he said, but their skill actually led them to believe that their disciplines held the answer to everything. And so they therefore wrongly combined their astronomy with their religion, which was their idolatrous worship of the stars, and this, he argues, culminated in the birth of astrology. So Pico ultimately used this new history to claim that astrology was tainted from its origins, and this sort of ruined everything about it. Now, Pico's disputations did kind of meet with mixed reviews. They were quite controversial, and this is only one of the many arguments that he put forth against astrology. But two leading figures at the time, namely the celebrated philologist Joseph Scaliger there on the left, and of course the famous astronomer and astrologer Johannes Kepler on the right, accepted much of Pico's historical argument and just sort of slightly altered things a little bit based on their own research. So Scaliger agreed with Pico that Eastern philosophy should not be emulated, but while Pico had suggested that astronomy and idolatry birthed astrology, Scaliger claimed that the two branches, astrology and astronomy, actually developed independently in two completely different areas. Now, it might come to no surprise that because Scaliger quite liked the Greeks, he said that the Greeks invented astronomy, and because he quite disliked astrology and the Near East, he said that the superstitious pagans of the Near East, of course, invented the cousin of astronomy, astrology, this abominable beast, he calls it. Okay, now Kepler, he sort of has a similar take, but he argues that astrology and astronomy kind of came from the same place, which is ancient idolatrous Chaldea. However, for Kepler, astrology came first, and it actually gave birth to astronomy. And for him, this explained why both astronomy and astrology needed massive reform, because they're both sort of tainted from their origins. So basically, these three authors each had kind of slightly different accounts of the exact origins of astrology, but the thrust of their accounts was new, and that was that astrology was corrupt from its beginnings. So although each of these people actually still acknowledged celestial influence more generally, they nevertheless worked quite hard to undercut these old, naive genealogies of astrology. And this revolutionized the way that astrology was thought about amongst many intellectuals. Basically, these humanists stripped idolatry of its once pious origins and used history to sort of rebrand it in a way as idolatrous superstition that was associated with, idolatrous star worship and pagan practices, etc. Okay, so part 3, from these new sort of genealogies of astrology to their popularization, I nearly said. So these new accounts of the history of astrology survived long into the 17th century, in part because these were three really famous and important people, but also because of dramatic changes in the way that humanist scholarship was kind of thinking about the past, as I've already suggested. So that sort of idea of paganizing ancient culture that was not ancient, sort of Judaic culture. Okay, so Eastern antiquity started to be seen as sort of a religious and philosophical golden age. So in a context in which people were kind of grappling with this new sort of revolutionary idea of ancient culture, new histories of astrology were popularized by a number of important writers, and I'm just going to talk about a few 17th century English cases this evening. And there's one example here on the screen. This is a guy called Edward Stillingfleet. He was an enormously popular apologist and theologian. And he argued that while the ancient Chaldeans were skilled in astronomy, their astronomical skills soon dwindled into astrology, and the root of this corruption lay in their idea that the stars were divine and to be worshipped. So the same sort of story that we've already heard. Similarly, the theologian and philosopher Henry Moore also attacked astrology's history in a number of his works, and he basically claimed that astrology was a rotten relic of ancient pagan superstition. So this humanist critique of astrology was also taken up by natural philosophers, and this is of course the famous experimentalist Robert Boyle, who also attacked astrology actually pretty much only on historical grounds. And he argued that the idolatrous pagan star worship of the ancient Near East had led them to believe that they could make predictions from these apparently divine beings, and ultimately all astrological practice was derived from these corrupt origins. So basically, this idea was becoming increasingly entrenched in the popular imagination, and the association between astrology and idolatrous star worship had become a key reason to condemn astrology. And we can see this more sort of practically, how this new historicizing attack was a threat to astrology's survival, by just briefly looking at one case study. And this is a group of people that I really love. So in the late 1640s, a group of naturalists and astrologers, many who would go on to become members of the Scientific Royal Society, formed the Society of Astrologers in London. And this group, which had about 40 members, some of whom are on the screen there, they sound like they had a really great time. So they met in the pub once or twice a year in London to have an enormous feast, have a bunch of beers, and talk about astrology and exchange instruments and manuscripts and things like this. So, I mean, they sounded like they had a really fun time. I wish we did that in our scientific societies today. Maybe we do, actually. But in an early letter to one of their patrons, the members of the society claimed that their ultimate goal was to reinstate astrology as an ancient and divine science. They wanted to demonstrate, they claimed, that astrologers were not the products of idolatrous paganism, but were actually really the noble children of Seth. So that's Adam's third son, who I mentioned earlier. And so the society actually commissioned a bunch of sermons. So alongside their sort of annual meetings at the pub, they first actually went to church and listened to a sermon about how godly astrology actually was, okay? kind of hard to imagine. And this is sort of some of them on the screen. One of them I love, the third one across, it says, intended to have been delivered but prevented by the sickness of the author. But he still just publishes it anyway. Which to me makes sense because this was really an apologetic move on the part of the society, right? So if they had prepared something that was going to help them, they were of course going to publish it, even if it actually wasn't delivered in person. So these sermons argued that, of course, in contrast to what their detractors were saying, astrology had a heritage that actually could be traced back to Adam. So they sort of provided all these examples of, evidence that might suggest that the biblical patriarchs were astrologers, but they also spent a lot of time talking about the story in Matthew 2 of the Magi's journey to Christ, which of course is premised on the idea that they saw a star in the sky. Okay, so commentators had long drawn attention to the similarity of this text with Numbers 24:7, which says, "There shall come a star out of Jacob," which was one of several oracles pronounced by the prophet Balaam, and it was typically seen as a messianic prophecy. Now, these parallels allowed commentators to propose actually a historical link between the Magi and this prophet, who was said to dwell in the east. And this explained, they suggested, how the Magi knew to look for an astrological meaning of the star. So the sermons argued that this particular story was, one, evidence that God was using what their enemies thought was pagan knowledge to bring the Magi to Christ. And two, it also was proof, they claimed, that a tradition of pure astrology had indeed been passed down from the Hebrews to the Magi, which of course served to kind of highlight the profound and divine history of astrology. Unfortunately, because I kind of love these guys, they failed in their attempts to rehabilitate astrology, and they dissolved in the 1680s, quite unfortunately, partly because a lot of them had actually died. Also, because one of their key members, William Lilly, had quite controversially actually predicted with astrology the 1666 London fire. Okay, he guessed it, right? Well, I mean, maybe astrology is right, and maybe he got it right. More likely, he probably guessed it. And people were pretty concerned by this because people who didn't agree with astrology said, well, obviously you set the fire yourself. And so he was chased out of town. So there's potentially some sort of political kind of issues going there as well. But anyway, the society sadly didn't survive. But I think that their efforts to try and legitimize their subject with sacred history suggests that they thought that their most powerful enemy was not science, but these kind of new damning histories of astrology. Okay, so to conclude, because I've been talking for quite a while. In the early modern period, humanist scholarship, and history in particular, had kind of become a useful tool in the identification of problem areas in medicine and natural philosophy and even in theology itself, which could then, once they'd been identified, kind of be either discarded or reformed, of course. And astrology was one of the theories that was subject to this humanist kind of pat-down. So Enlightenment views of astrology, an example of which we of course saw in Pierre Bay, were the culmination of a historical revisionism piloted by Pico. So in his book, Boyle cited Pico and also Kepler and Scaliger when he wrote his History of Astrology, ultimately claiming that it was a remnant of pagan superstition. And Bay thought that astrology had been wrongly adopted by Christians because of their unfounded reverence for Eastern antiquity. So some historians have given Bay and other Enlightenment philosophers the accolades for coming up with this new attack on astrology, but I think it's important to remember that they were popularising older humanist scholarship. So in the 17th century, humanist scholarship was not just the province of university dons, but was a wider preoccupation of the entire populace. And this cultural importance of humanities scholarship meant that it could actually have real impacts on the way that the public, not just scholars, thought about traditional doctrines. So when we tend to search for, or try and search for the origins of modernity, it's sort of tempting to look to the 17th century embrace of science and apparent rejection of Renaissance humanism as the key drivers of intellectual change. But what I'm trying to sort of do in my work more generally, but also in this project, is suggest that closer engagement with the intellectual work that early moderns were actually engaged in suggests that the humanities, as much as the sciences, shaped many of the developments that we tend to associate with modernity today. And incidentally, I think that this, perhaps rather than the usual moralizing, is quite a strong defense for the humanities today. In real conclusion, so the changes that were wrought to the status of astrology in the late 17th century were, of course, I'm a historian, I'm going to say it was complex, right? There are a lot of sort of things involved. But one leading historian of astrology recently said that he could point to no new compelling argument or discovery to explain why astrology lost its hold over the educated classes in this period. I suggested tonight that the redefinition of Eastern wisdom as idolatrous superstition might have been one of these arguments. So in other words, science never really had to think properly about astrology, and this was because humanist scholars had already done the hard work of rebranding it as superstitious non-science. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And so earlier in your talk, you mentioned how undergraduate Bachelors of Arts students would study astrology. And now you've almost graduated from your PhD, and now you're studying astrology. So it's kind of coming back around.
And I will teach my undergraduates astrology.
Excellent. I look forward to that. Again, another fascinating talk, I'm sure you'll agree. And I'd like to open up for questions for a few minutes before we finish. Yeah, Sam.
I really like the presentation. Have you come across in Israel, if you go to the first century time of Jesus' synagogues, have you come across the astrology there? Any comments and thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't personally been to Israel myself, but I know that in part of the story of Seth, the idea is that him and his sons wrote down astrology and all of these astrological theories on pillars so that they would survive, right? And I have heard that they are still somewhere, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, it amazed me that when you go to synagogues near where Jesus lived on the Sea of Galilee, etc., they often have astrological emblems on the floor of the synagogue, and they're connected with the time of harvest and the springtime and things like that. So obviously it was an accepted form, not something that was rejected at that time.
Absolutely. It's amazing when you know what to look for. Astrology and astrological symbols are everywhere. Of course, our days of the week are based on the 7 planets that were thought to be planets at the time, including the sun, which at the time was, of course, a planet encircling the Earth. It's pretty amazing. It is kind of everywhere. And of course, people actually, a lot of Jewish people as well, used astrology to kind of predict when the Messiah would be returning. And then also a lot of Christians use astrology to prove that Jesus was, try and prove that Jesus was the Messiah. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So from what you were saying, the critique was mostly from a historical perspective. From what I understand. Was there ever any, were there many philosophical critiques that came in, for example, Augustine's critique? Did they ever reference something like that? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that this was quite an important critique, but it was just not the only one, right? So there's philosophical critiques. There were even empirical critiques. But the thing was that astrology somehow managed to survive all of them, okay? So for example, a lot of historians used to think that as soon as people got rid of Aristotelian understandings of the universe, because Aristotle was kind of a big proponent of a certain type of astrology, that astrology had to have disappeared by then, right? So that's kind of a philosophical attack. But of course then, people sort of liked Platonic ideas of astrology, and then you can it was quite easy for astrologers to kind of just jump to something else as soon as there was another philosophical argument. So yes, there were philosophical arguments for sure, but a lot of people were not bothered by them. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have been bothered by them. I think probably some of them were quite convincing, but they kind of just didn't mind that much. Yeah.
There's 2 more questions at the front here, and then we'll...
Michelle, does your study cover also Central America, South America, Southeast Asia, and the complexities of what they discovered there and how it advanced? advanced in inverted commas they were in
Yeah.
study of the stars?
I mean, it's a really good question. Unfortunately, no. So I'm at the very beginning of this project, and I would love to kind of expand my horizons, right, and look outside of Europe, but I have not done that yet. But there's some amazing work by historians who have looked at Spanish astrology and how that influenced astrology that was happening in sort of Central America. And it's quite interesting, I mean, in terms of advancement, what we would think of as astronomical advancement, right? So wonderful kind of observatories and incredibly accurate kind of ideas of where exactly the planets were at particular times, right? That is still just 1 or 2 degrees off today, like incredibly powerful. That really was a lot of the time motivated by astrology, which I think is quite interesting. Science kind of has an embarrassing past in a way.
Whereas history doesn't, as you've shown.
No, as Tom has shown, history has never done anything right.
There's one more question. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for a wonderful talk. It reminded me of a presentation I gave in Utrecht in 2015, and that makes me sound old, makes me feel old. Anyways, it was about this debate in the German context around 1700, where Leonhard Christoph Sturm took on Johann Ludwig Hahnemann, and they really duked it out regarding astrology and its biblical legitimacy and all that. Now, the interesting thing about that skirmish was that actually Sturm had first tried to prove alchemy, astrology. Sorry, alchemy is my
Who's next? Yeah.
It's next, yes. And he set up this crucial experiment and forecast that the French king would die on such and such a date.
Yeah.
Of course, the stars bitterly disappointed him in that regard, and he became this intractable opponent of all things astrology. Now, I'm wondering if you came across other crucial experiments in your research, if that is something that is on astrologers' horizon, and then going one step further, what do you do when such an experiment fails?
Yeah.
Do you blame the art, or do you blame yourself?
Yeah.
I have a sense that in alchemy, for a long time, you blame yourself, and you go back to your sources, and you think you just need to read them better and understand them more fully, and then you'll get there. But maybe, eventually there was a point when astrologers gave up on fixing the art.
That's a really good question. So there's a lot of things going on there. So first, have I come across any other sort of similar kind of pseudo-experiments, right? In a way, yes, right? And so, for example, in the 15th century, there's this big prediction that there's going to be another massive world flood, okay? And this is sort of published in all of these pamphlets. Everyone gets really, really freaked out about it. And then the flood doesn't happen. And people go, wait, what? Does that mean that astrology is wrong? Or is it just a bad prediction, right? And so there's a lot of sort of examples of that where people start to sort of question things again. But the thing about astrology, it's so flexible. And this is in part because in sort of the ancient Greek sense, it was an art, right? So it was techne, but it was also a stochastic art, which meant that it was built into the very sort of fiber of astrology, and it was to be expected that it was educated guesswork, okay? The aim was to hit at a target, but a lot of the time the astrologer would miss, okay? And there's different things that you could put down to why that happened, right? It might be because we didn't have skilled enough instruments, or the astrologer himself made a mistake, or da-da-da-da-da. But it was expected by everyone that astrology actually would fail a lot of the time, okay? And sometimes its failures could be valuable in sort of a strange way. But that was a way that I think helped it to kind of outlive its life expectancy, I guess. Yeah, so if you're going to ever come up with something, built into it the idea that it could be a failure, right? I should do that with my papers from now on. This might be a failure. I'm expecting it. It'll be a happy surprise if it works.
That was great. Please join me in thanking soon-to-be Dr. Pfeffer. Well, there's some nice continuities between that paper and the next one. We're going to welcome Natasha Lunniss up next, who graduated from Christian Heritage College with a Bachelor of Liberal Arts just last year, 2019. Now, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but you majored in literature, is that right? Or yes, got it right. She majored in literature, but she also found a real knack for history as she went along, and her directed study which she is presenting tonight, was on Isaac Newton and the varying historical assessments of his interest in alchemy. Natasha is currently studying for a Masters of Museum Studies at the University of Queensland, although she has told me that further studying history is a possibility, and I certainly hope that she does take this path, and I'm sure you'll agree after you hear her presentation on the historiography of Isaac Newton's alchemy. Please welcome Natasha.
So, as Simon said, last year I completed my Bachelor's of Liberal Arts here at CHC, and as part of it I did a directed study on the historiography of Isaac Newton's alchemy. So tonight I hope to provide a bit of an overview on that paper and present an overview of the historiography of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. So, in examining the historical scholarship about Isaac Newton, one could be forgiven for thinking of him as purely the forerunner for the 18th century scientific revolution, particularly with his work in mathematics, mechanics, and optics. However, Newton also had great interest in the field of alchemy, a field that is dominated in public thought by imagery of occultism, magic, and witchcraft. Whilst a majority of historiography of Newton's alchemy throughout the 19th and 20th centuries placed his work under the title of occultism, and thus separated it from his research in physics and mathematics, it can be seen that this placement has led many to the conclusion that alchemy is more than empirical scientific experimentation, and the attempt by historians to recreate the pre-modern link between science and religion. As such, the characters of Newton as scientist and Newton as alchemist are not quite as paradoxical as the modern mind believes, and an examination into the historiography surrounding Newton sheds significant light on this, as does a consideration of pre-modern conditions of belief concerning esoteric practices like alchemy. These pre-modern conditions of belief are believed by Peter Harrison to be characterized by focus on the scientist's personal qualities and virtues. Before the 16th century, both science and religion were understood as concepts primarily of personal qualities and virtues, as built from the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. Religion was not understood as it might be today, as a discrete set of beliefs and practices. Instead, it was related to one's inner piety and worship, and served as a virtue that was commonly associated with justice. In the same way, science was not just a set of empirical and rationale-based investigations into the natural world, but was also considered to be a habit of mind or an intellectual virtue. However, it was in the 16th and 17th centuries where this relationship between the interior and exterior changed, altering the understanding of the connection between the inner being and virtues of a person and the natural world around them. Where the focus was mostly on the interior in the pre-modern mind, as seen in the role of religion and science, the early modern period saw a shift in focus to the exterior, and the shift brought to light the modern preconceptions of religion as doctrinal and practice-based, and science as purely being external experimentations. It also shifted the perception of alchemy from a physical process that influenced and shapes one's internal being whilst also investigating the natural world, to being merely a set of physical experiments that attempted to investigate the natural world. Critically, for our purposes here, this change shifted the perception of alchemy from an investigative act into both the natural world and the inner self of the alchemist, with the ability to transform the alchemist into an act that seeks only to investigate the natural world. Thus, Newton as alchemist becomes a chemist or biologist. The idea that the modern understanding of alchemy is limited can further be seen in the work of Eleanor Stump, who, in her explanation of the pre-modern concept of scientia, states all true excellence of intellect, wisdom, understanding, and scientia is possible only in connection with moral excellence as well. As such, it can be hypothesized that Newton saw science and the knowledge gained from it as being deeply connected to religion and concern regarding one's inner piety and state. However, such a belief and understanding of what Newton saw in alchemy was lost after the 17th century when science and religion became distinct entities. This then meant that modern understandings of alchemy, which evolved from this new thought, would in themselves lose a part of alchemy which was connected to the internal and identity of the alchemist. As such, to fully understand alchemy and why Isaac Newton became heavily involved in it, one must remove the bias that they are bringing, that is the modern preconceptions of science and religion, and instead view it from the time and eyes of the alchemist. Modern understandings of alchemy as being merely identifiable with a series of physical experiments can find its roots in the historiography of the 18th century, particularly the work of French historians Bernard de Fontenelle and Etienne Francois Geoffroy. In this period, scholars typically split alchemy from its newer and more rational scientific counterparts and limited it to the singular process of chrysopia. This is the transformation of metal into gold. The historiography of alchemical practice in this century characterized alchemy as charlatanic and fraud-based, casting it as an intellectual taboo and its practitioners as socially unacceptable and disruptive. As such, there was a decline in public advertisement and acknowledgement of the practice and existence of alchemy. Thus, when it revived in the 19th century, this was only in the context of occultist secrecy and the practice of witchcraft and sorcery. The revival of alchemy as part of Victorian occultism may be seen in the writings of the 19th century occultists Francis Barrow and Eliphas Levi. In their works, both Barrow and Levi place alchemy under the umbrella of the occult sciences, or transcendental magics, along with astrology, demonology, tarot, and Kabbalah. However, for neither Barrow nor Levi is this placement negative. Instead, both believe that by placing alchemy under these umbrella titles, that they are paying homage to and respecting the metaphorical element in alchemical practice, which describes and initiates a transformation in the alchemist's soul. Barrow in particular suggests that the implication for transitioning alchemy to the occult or magical is positive, because to wield such magic as alchemy requires a pure soul and an equally pure moral character. This is furthered by Levi, who suggests that alchemy transforms the character and soul of the alchemist by means of a divine knowledge, which is held in alchemy and has been passed down from ancient traditions. This 19th century revival of alchemy as an integral part of Victorian occultism can be seen as negative for the ultimate historiography of alchemy, for it in many minds degraded alchemy and limited it to a process that was understood as fanciful and purely imaginative. However, it can be seen that without this occult revival, modern opinions on alchemy, such as it being deeply connected to the psychological phenomenon and expression of the internal workings and psyche of the alchemist, would not exist today. This in itself is an evolution of the 19th century occultist views that alchemy requires and develops a particular moral character and state. Therefore, occultist views of alchemy start a trend in alchemical historiography that expand on the idea that alchemy is more than a physical investigation or series of experiments. It was during this occultist revival of alchemy that David Brewster wrote his 1829 biography of Newton, this being one of the first major historiographical responses to Newton's alchemy. Brewster wondered how, quote, a mind of such power and so nobly occupied with the abstractions of geometry and the study of the material world, such as Newton's, could stoop to be the copyist of the most contemptible alchemical poetry and the annotator of a work, the obvious production of a fool and a knave. Brewster's negative attitude towards Newton's interest in alchemical experimentation shows how alchemy was largely viewed in the 19th century as irrational, foolish, and false, and its practitioners were labelled as scoundrels, swindlers, fraudsters, and cheats. Even someone as eminent as Newton, who was renowned for his intellectual and scientific achievements, was cast as a weak-minded soul who was fooled and distracted by the charlatanry of fraudsters. It is also demonstrative of the aforementioned 18th century divide between alchemy and the other more rational sciences, and adds to it the belief that the rational sciences involved higher mental processes, such as abstraction, and investigated subject matter greater than found tactile natural materials. In transitioning to the 20th century, historians continue to both link alchemy with occult practice and emphasize its spiritual and transformative ability. This continuation highlights a shift in the modern thought of alchemy and its existence as something that transforms both internally and externally. This can be seen in the work of Dame Frances Yates, who saw alchemy as being focused on a form of illumination that is centered around the whole of a person, and the work of Carl Jung. Jung expands upon the work of the occultists Barrow and Levi, who argued that alchemy was demonstrative of a particular moral character or alignment. However, he furthers this and suggests that instead of being merely demonstrative of a specific character, that alchemy showcases a realization or a lack of understanding of one's character and an internal want to unravel this mystery. The idea that alchemy was deeply related to a personal journey and the solving of mysteries regarding one's life and person can be seen in the later 20th century work of Mary Churchill and Betty Jo Dobbs. Both Churchill and Dobbs saw that alchemy, especially for Isaac Newton, was a religious experience and allowed him to investigate the inner workings of the natural world and the possible existence of a transcendental order or deity. This marks a major shift in the modern conception of alchemy, where our chemical practices and experiments are seen as no longer being purely related to the physical realm, and instead reaches beyond to an internal and perhaps religious conflict or mystery. Churchill deduced that the moral and religious element in alchemy quite outweighs its technical aspect, and that this twofold nature of alchemy is a clue to Newton's profound interest in the writings of the adepts. And as such, it could be seen, particularly for Newton, that alchemists represented the true unsullied wisdom of the past, and that they were the preservers of teachings of the ancient wise men and of the earliest Christian church. Dobbs expanded upon Churchill's theory that alchemists believed that their practice contained within itself a sort of pristine truth, and states that Newton utilized alchemy to establish the parameters of a system that encompassed both the natural world and the divine world. This was also a system in which the divine continuously acted upon the natural, and the natural continuously acted upon the divine. However, this action and how it took place was the ultimate mystery Newton hoped to uncover through alchemy. Both Churchill and Dobbs present a view of Newton's alchemy that is cross-disciplinary. For both these scholars, Newton's alchemy cannot be divided into the individual sectors of science, alchemy, mathematics, and theology. Instead, they suggest that historians project upon Newton's work this scientific and theological divide, one that seemingly stems from the disenchantment of the Enlightenment period and did not exist in Newton's time. However, Churchill and Dobbs' theory of alchemy as an expression of Newton's religious journey is critiqued by modern 21st century historians such as William Newman and Lauren Principe. Both these historians purport that the unsatisfactory interpretations of Churchill and Dobbs stems from a lack of understanding and access to Newton's work. Even with this critique in mind, it seems that historians have much to gain from Churchill and Dobbs' interpretation, given that they view Newton's work not from the understanding of a post-Enlightenment modern, but instead from the time and cultural understanding of Newton himself. Ultimately, the 20th century historiography of Newton's alchemy may be summed up in the writings of John Keynes. In his essay, Newton the Man, Keynes states that Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the visible and intellectual world with the same eyes as those who began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. Isaac Newton, a posthumous child born with no father on Christmas Day, 1642, was the last wonder child to whom the Magi could do sincere and appropriate homage. Here, Keynes argues that alchemy carries within it a form of truth or religious knowledge that has been passed down from the ancient civilizations of Babylon and Sumer. However, for Keynes, Newton is not just the carrier of this distant forgotten knowledge, for that assumes that his knowledge has been understood and translated into modern culture. Rather, Newton is understood as much as the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last of such a legacy. By calling Newton the last wonder child, Keynes believes that Newton held within himself some sort of miracle or wonder that allowed for greater insight into his investigations of alchemical mystery. This wonder could be understood as being furthered by Newton's unconscious desire to unravel his identity and character, particularly as a posthumous child born with no father. Ultimately, this correlates with the suggestion by Jung that there is an individual psychological element to alchemical experimentation. The idea that Newton was the last to whom the Magi could do sincere and appropriate homage suggests not only is there some sort of spiritual or religious element to alchemy that connects it to these ancient traditions, but that there was a change in the modern society that distinctly split the scientific and rational from the spiritual and religious, and which Newton stood at the cornerstone of such a change. By drawing a connection between Newton and the Magi, Keynes also highlights how ideas of religion, spirituality, and magic were inseparable before this change, but are now in modern minds distinct entities that refuse to be connected. Ultimately, the historiography of Isaac Newton's alchemy is demonstrative of an epistemological legacy left by both the growth of so-called rationality from the scientific revolution and the disenchantment of the Enlightenment. Both of these, as Harrison argues, shifted social thought from the internal person to the physical external world. This legacy split the rational and scientific from the spiritual and mystic, thus limiting our modern understandings of what alchemy truly is and why supposed greats in the field of science, such as Isaac Newton, were fascinated by it. Because of such split, alchemy was removed to the throngs of occultism and outcast from day-to-day society, and it was viewed as such through the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. This historiography also showcases how alchemy cannot be understood in its entirety by those who bring to the historical study of it a modern preconception of science and religion, for these are focused on the external natural world. This is readily evident in the histories of Churchill and Dobbs. A more robust contextual understanding allows us to see that religion and science are more deeply connected to the internal self in a way that is difficult for our postmodern mind to grasp. We have seen here that this insight also illuminates the early modern practice of alchemy by figures such as Isaac Newton, and suggests a modern lack of understanding of alchemy led to the despising of it and the casting of it as a cult. Thus, 21st century historiography of Isaac Newton and his work in alchemy must start from the conclusion that for Newton, alchemy was related to the search for the ultimate truth regarding both himself and his place and role in the natural world, where ultimately the divine exists and is ever active. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Well done. And we'll take some questions. I just want to point out that there is a pile of Natasha's full papers at the back, so you can grab a copy of that if you want to see all of her research on this question. There's actually a whole section which, as the other speakers experience, whenever you have to give one of these talks, you have to cull about 80% of what you've prepared in the full paper. So Natasha's got a lot more work in there, particularly on Newton, the details of what Newton was interested in. So some of the historical work in is excellent. So I commend that to you if you want to see more detail. Does anyone have any questions for Natasha?
Thanks, Natasha. It's so interesting, the idea that by practicing alchemy, you're trying to do something to yourself, and that somehow the type of person that you are is going to affect the results of this experiment. Did that same way of thinking, like, was that also part of the way Newton approached maths and the way, I know he wrote extensively on theology as well. Does he have the same assumption that in various fields of inquiry, the inner life of the experimenter is a key component, or is that a unique feature of alchemy?
I haven't read much of his other work in mathematics or optics, but from my understanding of Newton, I think he believed that to be cross-disciplinary and just an underlying factor of his research. He never once took the internal and his own person outside of his work, and instead viewed everything he investigated as being connected to himself in some way.
It's very interesting because I was trying to think of which disciplines today still have something like that assumption. It's very big and very important in theology, and the claim is often made that the inner disposition of the researcher has some kind of, I don't know, is what's the word? Symbiosis or something with the subject matter, and I wonder if something like that is still part of the thinking in other disciplines too. It seems like it would come out of theology, I guess.
Natasha, did you want to explain a little bit about what Newton's alchemical practices were? I mean, he had complexities. Like, there's a very complex set of practices, as all these things are. Is there any kind of overview you can give us about that? Because this wasn't just an idea for him, but he actually practically investigated it.
Yeah. As I mentioned in my paper, there is a lot of new work that's being published online that showcases a lot of Newton's alchemy. Most of it in the 19th and 20th century was just notes and borders on his mathematical and optical works. But now we've got more manuscripts. I think for Newton, alchemy was not an individual field. His work in mechanics and optics was his work in alchemy. And this can be seen in his paper of nature's obvious laws and vegetation, where he looks at the mechanics of natural materials, but he also does a lot of physical alchemical experimentation, such as the growth of Diana's trees, which, for those who don't know, is the growth of metallic trees without any sort of vegetation. But ultimately, yeah, I think he thought that alchemy was everything else that he was doing. It wasn't just an individual field.
Please join me in thanking Natasha. Well, we're coming to the end of the evening. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great event. Please join me in thanking all three of the speakers once again. And look at that, there's even a slide that says thank you for coming. Thanks to Alex Crook for putting together a lot of the logistics, and the library staff as well for helping us a lot with the space and setting up. And if I can just give you a couple of dates for your diary. On April 22nd, we have a seminar planned that the School of Social Sciences here will be helping us to deliver. So they're going to join in with Millis Institute and put on this Christian Heritage College seminar in April. So keep an eye out for that. And in May, we have a further seminar planned with two eminent legal scholars coming to join us. So Professor Nick Caroni and Professor Mark Snedden will be coming to speak about Christianity, theology and law. So put those two dates in your diary, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for coming.